Hello and welcome to another video. Today I want to talk about non-fiction reading and how to do research in books that are a bit more difficult to read than just the normal fiction book. As an example, I have brought with me this lovely book, which is called Algorithms of Oppression by Safiya, and this was a really interesting read, but also not that easy to read, to be honest. I've only tapped the chapters because in each of the chapters I had quite a lot of things to say, so you can see that I did a lot of underlining and I put in a lot of notes. And the topic that this book talks about is basically how systems that we use nowadays, such as search engines, but also probably AI and chatbots, are based on a lot of data that is not very good and very balanced in terms of different population groups. So this author is a Black woman, and that's what she talks about the most in this book, but a lot of the things that she finds out and that she says in here are also things that are relevant to women generally, and that is a topic that I want to learn more about and that I will be talking about as well through my job and for some events in my home area. And since I'm doing this anyways, I thought I would share with you how I went through the different stages of researching this topic, and in this case, how I got through a book that has so many scientific examples and actually citations as this one, and that is very scientific to read rather than just reading a storyline. So I hope you're interested, and let's get started. So for my first step that I did in researching this topic, I actually basically just went through the book. And in doing that, I picked up a pen that is very handy for this kind of things, that has 4 different colors. And with that one, I just went through here and I marked things in different colors. So anything that is directly related to biases, I highlighted in red. I highlighted anything that I wanted to quote in the way that it was said in blue. Anything that was just interesting in general is black. And then things that sounded like really good ideas or things that we should look into and do more of, I highlighted in green. So those are the different colors, and I only tapped the chapters of the book because I knew that I would be doing a lot more data collection than just reading it, just to be able to get through all the things that this book talks about. And whenever I had read a bit of it and I had marked it down in this way, I went over to my research journal, or maybe you could call it commonplace book, and I wrote down all the things that I had found. So in black is just the normal things that I realized or that I summarized from the book. And in blue with those quote symbols, anything that I did quote directly from the book. And then I always used the opposite color kind of to make comments on that as well. So anything that's written in like this cursive script is things that I thought about it so that I can tell the difference, but I also didn't need too many pens, and that was just easier to go through it. And in this step, I did write quite a lot down. Actually, I probably wrote down too much, but I haven't done research like this in quite a while, so it wasn't that easy to decide what was relevant and what wasn't, and this was the first book that I read on this topic. So in that case, I think it's completely fair to just go ahead and note down everything that is interesting and relevant, of course. And then in my second step, I started to go through those notes once I had finished the whole book and just put down what topic they relate to. So I basically started giving out topics when I started going through the beginning And then once I had a few topics given out, I tried to stay true to those, but of course some things only came up later in the book, so I was allowed to make up new topics as well. And the idea behind that is just to find some clusters in all the things that I took down. And in the end, I was successful in creating quite a few clusters, even though it didn't work out completely fine just in the first go through. So my goal to have a more organized view on all of these topics is to create a mind map of all the things that I've learned from this book. And I want to use my clusters to put them in special areas so that I can make it make sense and that I can connect the ones that are actually interconnected. And to have those clusters ready, I wrote down all the categories that I gave out in the previous step. And I have found a few areas where I really don't need to make too many categories out of the same thing. So I figured I could cluster some of them, while others are quite well chosen and came up quite a lot. And now we're ready to read through all of the entries in one of these categories and then decide what to write down for them in the mind map. And basically, I'm gonna set all of this up and you can watch me do that while I tell you what I found out about this topic. Let me quickly say something about my mind mapping process before I get started on the actual content of my map on here. It's not going to be a mind map in the very classical sense of only connecting some key words, because that's not the amount of information that's in this book. There's so much more detail in there. So instead, I'm going to go with clusters. And I will have a mind map basically of the clusters, and all of the clusters will have their own separate points. And my idea in finding out which categories to use in the beginning is basically so that I can decide on how to structure the whole page so that I can put things close to each other that actually make sense together. So yeah, with that said, obviously I need to look back at my notes to collect all the different points for each of the clusters, so you'll see me flipping back and forth quite a lot. And let's get started. The first cluster that I have in looking at biases in search engines is the cluster users. So there was quite a bit of talking about how users or the society's values are reflected in the search results. And the question basically is, are the users actually the problem rather than the algorithms? Because as long as the users or the majority of users are typically white men, it will probably not change too much in terms of what the search results will be. The funny thing about this was also that it was noted in, I think it was 2012, that many users cannot tell the difference between ads and real results. And I don't think that it's quite that bad at this point, but if you're being influenced, I think often you can't tell how much is actually an ad or commercial interest rather than actual information. So maybe it still is relevant after all. In terms of ads, which is the second cluster that I'm going for, it does make sense, and it was said in the basis of the creation of the search engines that obviously if the search engine is paid for by ads, then it will be inherently skewed towards those paying advertisers and also towards its own interest. So Google will focus on things that it owns rather than just advertising everything equally. And also one more point in terms of looking at ads is that it is much harder nowadays to actually have really high journalistic values, because the only thing that is important at this point is getting a number of clicks, and that doesn't mean that you have to have a really well-researched article for that. So let's move back over towards the user side and look at trust. And that is a thing that really scares me, because a lot of users don't understand how the system works. And I won't say that I completely understand how a search engine works, but it's literally the same for AI nowadays. And users still trust it to show the most relevant or most popular information. And they also trust the companies almost implicitly, especially if they provide a service that is used a lot. And that is something that I'm really, really worried about, because if you don't really know what a system does and you just trust it just because, that sounds like a dangerous step to take. And at this point, I'm gonna have to skip ahead to my whole fully set up page, because otherwise it's just gonna take a very long time to film all of this and a very long time in editing. So please bear with me as we go through the rest of these things in my finished mind map. And here it is. Everything is set up now, so we can continue on with the trust area and basically go ahead to look at how algorithms are not neutral. So all algorithms that are used in systems are created by some people, and those people make decisions on how the algorithms work. So they can be contextual and they can be manipulated, and you can't do anything about it as a user. This leads to the development and who it's done by, because a lot of the development, especially in software, is still done without any feminist or people of color point of view. So with white men deciding on how to develop those apps, you can already tell what they will focus on. And basically all the developers don't have training in social issues, and they don't really think about those types of considerations a lot of the time. While on paper this whole area is a meritocracy, it actually is quite exclusive, and things are developed for the majority of users and not for specific groups. And what also plays into these algorithms that are not actually neutral is the data bias. So basically the data that we use for those algorithms and to train those on, this data already encodes prejudice, bias, and misunderstanding. And while the system may be in the idea objective, a lot of the metrics that they use can often be manipulated, such as search engine optimization, for example. Also, the way that search engines were built was based on wrong assumptions, with the internet being equated to academic papers, which might have been true in the beginning, but definitely isn't true now. So that was not the best place to start. And in all of this area, elites can always influence you more than other people can. And often the quality of the data that is used is not checked and then can be manipulated through some things such as cloaked websites, for example. So, moving on from data bias to the next category, we have misrepresentation and stereotypes. And this is quite interesting as well, because search often brings up negative stereotypes, and minorities cannot do much about it because they just don't have the power or resources. This also means that automated decision making is often not fair, and those stereotypes are often used in ads as well, and can even be used in forms of propaganda that is brought up by the search engines. And this leads us to another point that we will get to, the categories, but to get there we also need to look at data gathering, which the search engines do for their advertisers as well, and for themselves, of course. So data gathering means that users trade their privacy for free services, but it also can mean that some publications that were made before the internet was present are now made openly available for all people, even though they might not have been meant to be available for everybody, which is also kind of a problem. And all it does is basically give the company more data that they own. And a lot of this data collection goes unnoticed, which makes it even harder. But with that in mind, we can go to the categories that are often similar to those used by cataloging systems, that have been found multiple times to misrepresent marginalized groups and women, which is not that great. So basically everything was assumed to be male, and women were like, it was always an add-on. It was never for women in that sense. And categories also become relevant in terms of data gathering, because the search engines try to group all the users into some categories that they can use for advertising. And all of these categories basically are only a social construct that is based on the culture of the social norm in that area. And that area is usually the United States, because they still make up most of the internet usage. So yeah, what can then be done about it, or what does that mean? There can be some forms of regulation. Those usually go towards either how things are developed, how the algorithms are used, or what data is used. So it is possible for example, Google to delete certain things in their search results if they are required to do that by law. So especially in the European Union, there are quite a few laws about things that are not allowed to be found, and those things can be taken out. So you have content moderation and you have manipulation of the data that the system can show you. And that is a form in which the system is regulated. But a lot of the content moderation is again based on the social norms of the majority. So while it might not be great for some minority group, it will just be left in because the majority doesn't care. And another form of regulation is also the right to be forgotten or to have your data deleted, which is quite important as well, because otherwise, if you did something stupid in your young years, you might be stuck with it forever. And they do say the internet never forgets, which might be true, but it is quite a difference whether the information is just available somewhere on the internet or whether it pops up on the front page of Google. So the question that remains is, how should you do this type of regulation to ensure that biases are decreased and that you don't have harmful information? But that is an open question. And in terms of the results of all of this going on, of all of these biases and these interactions, you can see that a lot of predictions are skewed against minorities, which might either be because of data not being available and that being the basis for a bias, or other biases because people have prejudices. You also have bad public images that certain groups are found as, which obviously doesn't help them. Search engines can influence election results because it makes a difference if people can be found and what you can find about people. And search engines can help increase hate and wrong information and the spread of fake news from, for example, fake news websites or other cloaked websites. And basically, everything this says already is that society is kind of starting to devolve into more of the self-centered bubbles that we can sometimes see today as well. So yeah, that's all the content that I put together. If you want to read it, just stop the video here and have a look. But it took me quite a long time to go through all of this, and that's fine. And so I'm happy that I now have quite a good mental image because, as I said, I will be talking about all of this and more soon on stage, so I need to be prepared, and I do feel a lot more prepared now already. But I do want to end with one more bit of information, because I was talking about the whole process of reading through this book, making tons of notes, clustering these notes and creating this mind map. And that's of course a very detailed process, and that of course also took more time than it would need to take to just look through the book in terms of things that interest me. One thing that I can recommend for sure is already taking notes if you come across a book that is mentioned or another research that is mentioned that interests you, so that you can have your book recommendations somewhere you can find them again, and that you can in the end decide which ones are most interesting to you. But also, this is not the way that I would go ahead and look at any of the books or nonfiction books that I read, because this was very time consuming and very detailed. And I've already continued my research and looked into another book that I'm already through with as well. And as you can see, I've tabbed this one quite a lot, but I haven't actually underlined anything. So I used a lot more tabbing colors for this one, which is Unmasking AI by Dr. Joy Buolamwini. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her, I'm sorry. But basically what I did here is I went with the type of book that it is. And this is more of a mixture between a scientific nonfiction and a memoir or something like that. So what I did was I picked 5 different colors of tabs and I decided what each color would mean, and then basically used them to highlight different paragraphs on the pages that were relevant. And this gives me a very nice looking book, of course, and it also gives me the option to look into what she said about specific areas of interest, but I don't have to write down as much. Again, what I did do in this book as well was writing down anything that sounded like an interesting other book to look into, so that I have my references available already and don't have to go through it again to find them. So yeah, this was a quite different video to just talking about what I read last month. So I hope you still enjoyed it, and I hope maybe that there was something interesting and useful in it for you as well. And let me say this much, I will be talking more about AI and biases in AI and what you should know about it if you are a woman specifically, because I can't talk too much about racism, but I can definitely talk about sexism for sure. So if that is a topic that interests you, please come back and wait for that video to come out. And until then, I hope you have a great day and thank you for watching. Bye!